Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. This episode, I'm talking with Robert Mary. Bob is a political and governmental reporter. He's been a publishing CEO. He's been a political commentator. And more recently, he has been the author of many books on American history. As I mentioned in the previous episode, I recorded this conversation with Bob together. We spent a couple hours talking about two of his books, and so I'm releasing them separately because they're about two separate books and two different presidents. And this part of the conversation, which I'm releasing separately, we talk about William McKinley, who was the 25th president of the United States. Bob wrote a fantastic biography on McKinley called President McKinley, Architect of the American Century, which has received a lot of praise from many places. And when the book came out, I know he did a lot of media appearances, about this for, as you'll see in the conversation, a variety of reasons. McKinley is not so far back in history, much as with the earlier conversation we had about Polk, where it took place many years ago in the early in the 19th century. McKinley was president in 1900, so right at the start of the 20th century. And of course, we didn't know what the 20th century would hold. Of course, it's been so many advancements in technology and the digital age of sorts, but in so many wars and many things. But it was right there at the precipice of things. And he notes in his book and in the conversation this kind of way in which McKinley had a good temperament and a vision of sorts of trying to understand where the country was growing as it was expanding into still kind of industrial age. And so the book does a fantastic job of talking about President McKinley, and definitely I think so in the conversation as well. We start out by talking about the character and temperament of McKinley. Who was this guy? What made him tick, as best we can know? We talk about it in the beginning. He's kind of an enigma, and kind of all presidents are in their own way. And so, but he had this really incredible drive, and he was able to find a way. And it's a very interesting kind of character profile, if you will. We talk about Ohio of the time of McKinley as he was growing up, and how Ohio was very similar to a very early United States. We talk about the impact of the Civil War on McKinley. We talk about tariffs. You can't really talk about this period of time in U.S. history without talking about tariffs. And obviously he had his own bill that he put forward. And so, tariffs are a big part of the conversation here. We talk about the brilliance of the 1896 election in terms of the campaign itself. We talk about the vision of McKinley for his first term and how he really was emphasizing economic prosperity, not necessarily this expansionist, ever-growing empire. Many people will attribute that to McKinley, but it's not quite clear that that's what he was attempting to do. It kind of sort of, one of the things that happened with various circumstances. We talk about the annexation of Hawaii. Obviously, the challenges with Spain being in Cuba at the time. We talk about the Spanish-American War, how McKinley, received the Philippines in that acquisition, and Guam and all these other places, and how he was able to manage some of those acquisitions. Talk about why he decided to run for a second term. We talk about, towards the end, the impact of Teddy Roosevelt, of course. He was the vice president for the second term. Obviously, McKinley was the third president to be assassinated, or to die by assassination. So, Roosevelt finished out almost his entire full term. We talk about how in that second term, trade reciprocity was a major policy issue that McKinley was going to emphasize, and how it never really happened. And Bob really talks about how his ideas were to try and enact that and get that done. And it's very, very fascinating what could have been about that bit in particular. And so this conversation was really, fantastic in a way that, I found very obviously educational, but it's really interesting to think about a president that most people don't think about that often. But it wasn't that long ago, and how there's a kind of overshadowing of other presidents, the Roosevelts and Wilson and President Johnson, etc. But McKinley, I think on Bob's side, I think he attributes McKinley to possibly it could have been, a great president we would have talked about had he not been killed so shortly. So, it's a really fascinating part of our history. Again, Bob's book is really fantastic. It is a kind of go-to one-volume authoritative critical biography on McKinley. And I couldn't think of a better book on McKinley. And so now I bring you Robert Mary. I'm here with Robert Mary. Bob, thanks so much for being willing to talk to me about President McKinley. You have written a fantastic book called President McKinley, Architect of the American Century. And as I was telling you before we recorded here, he is a fascinating character, fascinating person, fascinating president. And your book really kind of elucidates that. You mention it in the book, and I agree. He's a tantalizing enigma. And he. I feel like all presidents are in their own way. There's a mystery to them, an allure. But how is he different? Talk to us about kind of the character of McKinley. Give us a kind of character portrait of him, and why he's got a lot of different angles to him.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to do that. Let me start by sort of noting my subtitle, which I will say I felt at the time that I wrote it was somewhat audacious.
Okay.
Architect of the American Century. Because he's not generally viewed by historians as the architect of the American century, or an architect of the American century. But I felt that he was a man who had changed the presidency. He made America an empire. When he was elected, America was not an empire. When he was killed 4+ years later, America was an imperial power. And we were far flung. We had that big navy, which Teddy Roosevelt sent around the world in the Great White Fleet. So there's a bit of an enigma right there, because he's not getting the respect, perhaps, by the historians that he deserves, or that I think he deserves. And yet he accomplished a great deal. And how did he do that? Well, there was a certain stealthy leadership to this guy. He was not a man of great force. He didn't have what in today modern terms we call charisma, particularly. He was stolid and solid, and he moved somewhat slowly, and he thought a lot about decision making. But ultimately, he made bold decisions, and he brought people around to his point of view with a very, very light touch, and yet very, very effectively. So I think that a lot of historians have kind of assumed, in fact, it's clear that many historians have taken the position, which I totally disagree with based on my research, that yes, a lot of things, big things happened on McKinley's watch, but it wasn't because of him. They just, events kind of washed over him, and he was sort of like the passive recipient of forces that were beyond his control. Well, the record doesn't, if you look at it carefully, the record doesn't support that thesis at all. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, and things happened because he wanted them to happen. And things didn't happen because he didn't want them to happen. And yet, it wasn't like he had his iron grip on things, or at least the appearance of it. He always seemed to get one of his, Elihu Root, his war secretary in the second term, said that he always got his way. People couldn't understand how he did that because he wasn't arm twisting, and he wasn't pontificating, and It wasn't being fiery in any way, and yet he always seemed to get his way. I'll tell you one anecdote. There's a congressman from Ohio, McKinley was from Ohio, who I don't think liked McKinley all that much, but he very much liked McKinley's big handler and aide, Mark Hanna. Ben Butterworth was his name. And he said, if McKinley and I were walking through an orchard with but one bearing tree, and that tree had but two apples, McKinley would walk under that tree. He'd pick the two apples. He'd put one in his pocket. He'd take a bite out of the other one. And he'd turn to me and say, "Ben, do you like apples?" He wasn't. I think that Butterworth was not attempting to describe McKinley in any way that he liked. But what he said was that McKinley was a man who always seemed to get what he was looking for, what he wanted, and never was always friendly about it. And you can never quite figure out how he pulled that off all the time.
That's a great story. That's a great story. Well, yeah, you basically express that at different points throughout the book, and so I felt in this book that I gotta, a lot of people don't know about McKinley aside from, he was assassinated, and he. Some people know about the election, which we'll talk about, which was the first election. But yeah, he's kind of an unknown, and so it's you get like a flavor of his character and who he is, and he's a lot of mystery, and he's this way of he gets it done, and you don't really know how he gets it done, but he gets it done, which is
exactly right.
Interesting. It's so interesting, which makes him just more. You want to know more and learn more about him. There's just a few background things on him, just a few things. So you mentioned he was from Ohio, and so you talk about just how Ohio was, what Ohio was. We know what Ohio is like today, but how it was at the time he was born. Some of his family's background, some of the, they had their religious affinities, the sense of duty, patriotism, hard work, all of these things were really key. And then kind of his own personal skills of being just kind of a natural speaker, and trying to win arguments or have arguments without any kind of animosity. So just kind of his contextual background, his family background, and a little bit of his own personal qualities when he was growing up.
Well, let's start with Ohio. Ohio was kind of what you might call a microcosm state. And the reason is because it was a crossroads state. It had all kinds of rivers and canals, and then the railroads were coming, and it was in the middle of the country, and therefore both north and south and east and west, it was a crossroads. And it brought, as a result of that, of its location, it brought people into Ohio that made it a kind of a microcosm, because it had Southerners from the south, in the south of Ohio. It had Scots-Irish from Kentucky and Tennessee that had moved up. It had New Englanders in the northern part and from the central Atlantic area. And so all these people are sort of meshed together in a way that they ultimately would be meshed together in the United States. So it's no accident that so many of our early presidents were from Ohio. Because they represented this mesh, if you will, and in a way that made them resonant as politicians.
Makes sense, yeah.
So that's kind of what they came out of. Now, Ohio was a state that, while it had all these different threads and strains, was very much a strong unionist northern state. And the McKinleys were very much out of that mold. They were strongly patriotic. They were anti-slavery. The family subscribed to Horace Greeley's weekly New York Tribune that went to all across the country. It was a hugely successful newspaper, very much abolitionist. So when he grew up, he was 18 years old and just out of school. He had gone to college, but he had some kind of an infirmity, some kind of a health issue that sent him back to Ohio from the East. And then the war came, the Civil War. And at age 18, he immediately decided that he had to entered the war, and he went in as a private and ended up the war as a brevet major. So he had a very successful war experience, which we can talk about. So I would say that it was sort of heartland America, and he was a personification of what we might call heartland America.
Is that two small points on that? It sounds like with Ohio that there's still Ohio of today. I mean, obviously there's some ways it's expanded, but it sounds like there's a lot of vestiges of that still today, of this kind of, there's all different types of folks from different places. And, Southern Ohio is different from Eastern Ohio, which is different from Western Ohio and Central. And it sounds like there's still today vestiges of that kind of makeup as it was in his day. Yeah, it's just very fascinating.
You're absolutely right.
And then, I wonder just about his family. So you mentioned the patriotism piece. I think they were pretty religious, which wasn't abnormal for the day. I mean, it was a pretty, Protestant. How are all these things, hard work and sense of duty? These things contribute to, obviously there's his own personality and his own temperament, which, is a part of that. It's its own thing as well. But how are these things kind of contributing to who he is and who he's becoming and all of these things?
Well, I think that a significant part of it is the family values that were imparted in him, especially his mother. His father was gone a lot. He in the time when we were moving into the industrial era, he ran these forges, steel forges, and so he had various operations in various places. So he was flitting around the area a bit. But the mother was a very strong personality and strong views and a strong sense of character. There's a story about her that usually affects me when I think about it. William McKinley, her son, was governor of Ohio, and she's going to Columbus to visit with him. And she's on the train, and somebody wants to strike up a conversation with her. I think maybe she didn't really want to talk, but she certainly wasn't going to be bragging because that was just against her values. So the woman says, "Oh, are you going to Columbus?" "Yes, I am." "Oh, do you have relatives there?" "I have a son there." That's all she said. Didn't say who happens to be governor of this state.
Right. Isn't it so fascinating how I feel like that happens a lot more often, even still today, where people just, they don't want to be bothered with the kind of fanfare. They just want to keep a low profile. And it's very interesting how, even still after that point, it's a kind of testament to maybe some of the humility or kind of the aspects of trying to just work hard. You mentioned the war. So he has a career in the military, and he fights in the Civil War, and even if I remember this correctly, he fought at Antietam. Is this correct?
He did.
Yeah.
It turns out
right where I live. I actually live very close to Antietam.
By the way.
Yeah.
Oh, we don't.
Yeah.
He was just 18, as I said, when he went into the service. Mm-hmm. He was a master at organization. He had an organizational capacity that was spotted by his superior officers, including his one of his general officers who later became president. They put him in the quartermaster corps because he could run things and make sure the trains were running on time and the meals came on time, etc. So he was a quartermaster sergeant at this time. And during Antietam, and you may recall the battle started very early in the morning, and his unit that he was attached to didn't have time to have any breakfast, and the battle raged all day, and now it's well past lunchtime. And these troops were starving. They were stuck in a certain area that you couldn't get to because the battle was raging. So McKinley loaded up a wagon with coffee and water and sandwiches, hardtack or whatever else that they had at the time. And he started moving. He was going to try to get that wagon to the troops that were stuck. And on two occasions, a superior officer saw him and said, "What the hell are you doing? Go back! You can't. I got to feed the troops. I can't. You can't get there." But they moved on because the battle was raging, and so he ignored him and he went there, and he had to make a mad dash at the very end to get to a position where he was sort of safe with these stranded troops, and he did. The back of the wagon was shot off, but he still managed to get a lot of food and water and coffee to these troops. Well, that got a lot of attention from his superiors.
Sure.
So he became an officer at that point, and then raised up through the ranks. And there were other, not quite as dramatic, but there were other episodes of daring do that demonstrated that he was a man of considerable courage.
Yeah, I guess.
Let me say that to get to your sort of question, what made the guy? I think that really made him, because he was 22. He was a war hero. He was a major, and he clearly wanted to get into politics. So it gave him a great deal of confidence, in a sense that he was a man who could rise among his peers.
Yeah, I think I remember reading in the book that obviously any war is going to change a person of sorts, and especially the Civil War, which was still one of the worst wars that we've had. And so it seems like it was a transformative thing of all of these, he's very young, all of these, things he was raised with, all of these principles, and then, being in a really tough war. Well, then, there's a lot of things there, such as some sense of duty and honor and loyalty, and working hard and being very diligent, very organized. Is all of these things that kind of, I think, it seems as if it was very important to shaping how he would later do this in politics and then as president. He after the war, he gets into law for a little bit, and then on to congressman, kind of when we're talking about, again, trajectory. Again, that's very common even still today, law and congressman. What was it for him that wanted to do law a bit and then move into to Congress?
Well, to get back to the war, because it helps answer that question.
Sure.
He came under the spell of Rutherford B. Hayes, who was his commanding general. And Hayes he was the one, there were others too, but particularly Hayes identified McKinley as somebody that he really thought had a future, because he just seemed so solid and so competent and effective and unaffected. And so he kind of adopted McKinley to some extent. And there's writings of his expression indicating that he thought of McKinley as somewhat like a son. And so he became a great mentor. Now, Hayes left the military before the end of the war to run for Congress. And so he went into Congress during the war. And he was elected president in 1876, the same year that McKinley entered Congress as a congressman. And so here's his man in the White House. So he found himself in a rather rarefied situation where he could sort of, invited over to the White House on a pretty frequent occasion, big dinners, small dinners, etc. So he got a sense that this is part of my life, and I'd like this life to be continued. And he wanted to pursue a political career like his mentor, Hayes. Now, Hayes gave him some interesting advice. He said in a letter, which I quote in the book, I'm not sure, I said, I can understand why you want to do that, but I'm not sure that's what you ought to do. There's a lot going on. There's industrialization of America, the railroads. You might want to go into business, and you could do very, very well. I think that was after he became a lawyer and was practicing law with the idea that he wanted to run for Congress. And Hayes said, you can make a hell of a lot more money if you were to go into business. But that wasn't what he wanted. And so he pursued his dream.
Yeah, no, that's important. I remember reading about how Hayes was so instrumental, and of course, Hayes does become the 19th president with that wild election of '76. It was one of the most wild elections we've had.
I think it was a stolen election, actually.
Yeah, it was by one vote or something with Tilden or whatever it was. It was something wild. So he's a congressman, and he goes on to become governor. I don't know if you want to talk. We can talk about it later or here. But there was also the McKinley Bill. Maybe you can talk about that and how he was the author of this bill. I believe what it was, why it was important, and then how it became important again as first term. But yeah, we talk about that, and then also him as governor and what that was like.
Well, I've written two presidential biographies, one of McKinley and one of James K. Polk, and both of them were very significant on the trade issue, and the tariff issue, and protectionism versus free trade. Polk was probably the greatest free trader of our presidents, in the sense that he really slashed tariff rates when he was president in the 1840s. And McKinley was probably the greatest protectionist. And he was known as somebody who thought that whatever ails you, it can be solved through raising tariff rates. It's a little bit like the supply side people, politicians of today, who think that if there's something really going on bad on the economy, all you got to do is lower taxes, which may or may not be the case depending on what other circumstances might be. And I think that was the same way with tariffs. Interesting thing about McKinley was that later, when he became president, maybe we can talk about this when we get there, he, while still a protectionist, still believer in tariffs, began to realize that America was moving into an era of economic power where it was incumbent upon us to reduce rates judiciously to foster more and more trade. But nevertheless, that's what drove him. And he mastered it. The tariff can be very, very complex because there's all kinds of products and they have different duties, and he mastered it all. And then he became chairman of Ways and Means, under which tariff rates were adjudicated. And bear in mind that tariffs were largely where our revenues came from in the United States in those days. So that was the central revenue source. Very, very powerful issue.
So how did this, continue as, when he was governor? He was governor for one term, is this correct?
One term, yes.
Yeah. And so what were, I guess, tariffs were a major issue, but what were his major issues as governor of Ohio? And how did he try to kind of reign, I guess, or govern, I should say, as governor?
Well, I would know one thing in particular that informs us about what the nature of politics might have been at that time. He was a Republican, and the Republican Party came out of the slavery issue initially, but dominated American politics throughout the second half of the 19th century. And it was the party of industrialization. It was the party of expansion. It was the party of railroad building and giving up land grants for universities. All of those things, very civic minded. Yeah. And also had been the abolitionist party or the anti-slavery party before the Civil War, taking us into the Civil War. And so what we see in McKinley as governor is that he managed to straddle a political environment in which he had very, very good relations with labor in Ohio. And there was a lot of burgeoning industrialization in Ohio at that time. It had all those rivers and all that power.
Sure.
But also it was the party of industrialization and the party of business. And we hadn't reached a point where there was a big split yet. It was happening. It was emerging. But McKinley fought it, the split between labor and capital. But he kind of managed to merge those during his governorship. There were some significant labor disputes, some leading to demonstrations and even some violence. And he was quite the adjudicator during that time. So I would say that was kind of the main thing that sort of emanated out of his gubernatorial experience.
So many people have discussed kind of this brilliance of the 1896 presidential campaign. It's, there's a few. Some people could say more recently, just as a not a comparison, but just as a reference point, that many people attribute the 2000 campaign for Bush was fairly good in terms of running a campaign, I should say. Many people point to 2008 with Obama's campaign. It was a very well-run campaign, et cetera. There's I'm sure people could think of others as well. I'm just as a reference point for more modern times. Was 1896 presidential campaign also, does it really get that kind of like, just got this way of effectively reaching the electorate and how people could get out and vote and got everyone around this one person? And so maybe just talk about that and kind of the front porch strategy, which was super interesting. I could be wrong on this, but I recall there was some reference to this. I could be wrong. When more recently, when Biden had to campaign over Zoom or do all these video calls during 2020 because of the pandemic, and I recall it must have been some article I read somewhere where people were like, 1896, McKinley had this front porch strategy. So maybe just talk about the campaign and what made it great or not, and the front porch thing and how he beat Jennings Bryan.
Well, let me note initially that often we see turning points in presidential politics when a presidential candidate either manages to bring in new voters into his camp, as Nixon did with the George Wallace voters, as Reagan did with the so-called Reagan Democrats, et cetera.
Right.
Or others have done with immigration, et cetera. And the other factor is when a new technology is exploited beyond what others had thought was possible and therefore gave an edge. You think about Franklin Roosevelt and the radio, John Kennedy and television, et cetera.
Right.
The context of the 1896 election wasn't one in which new voters were going to be brought in exactly, but it was one in which an approach to electioneering was designed to pull voters to the candidate. So you have to understand the context. McKinley was nominated at a time when Republicans had dominated presidential politics since Lincoln. And we had only one Democrat, Cleveland. During that time, he was elected twice, non-consecutively.
Right.
And he thought that the issues would be pretty much the same. And it would be the tariff. It was always a tariff. But we had the panic of 1893, which was still ravaging the American economy. And the result of that, it was just giving huge body blows to rural Americans and farmers, particularly in the West and the South, who couldn't get liquidity because there wasn't money for them to borrow in order to get money for crops and seedings and whatnot. And that led to a great populist uprising, manifest in the brilliant populist oratory of William Jennings Bryan. And that swept the country and scared the heck out of McKinley and Mark Hanna, his operative. And so they decided that it was going to be necessary to take a different approach. Previously, it was midnight parades and torchlight parades and rallies, and just you're basically you're attempting to energize the base, as we say in today's political lexicon.
Right.
But Mark Hanna recognized that no, we need to explain this situation to our voters, because they're going to get caught up in this populist wave unless they understand what it's all about. We're going to have to get into the weeds of political explanation. And so that led to a different approach, not so much the torchlight factor, but materials, brochures and booklets and newspaper articles and newspaper advertising and all kinds of communications to basically explain the issues. And that was an innovation, a very significant innovation. And it needs to be noted that just like direct mail, which came much, much later, it's very expensive. And this approach was also very expensive. Well, it turns out that Mark Hanna was a master at raising money, so he was able to raise vastly more money than William Jennings Bryan was able to do. So that was significant. And Bryan was traversing the country, giving speeches all over the place, 8, 10, 12 speeches a day on that train going from place to place and whistle stops. And so this was relatively new also. And Mark Hanna says to McKinley, "You're going to have to do this." And McKinley says, "I'm not going to do it." He said, if I try to match him, he's going to outbid me, and I'm not going to be able to do it. And he knew he didn't have the stamina, and he probably didn't have the oratorical lawn to pull it off. So instead, he orchestrated this front porch strategy. It wasn't totally original with him. It had been done, I think, maybe by Benjamin Harrison, but he did it in a much greater fashion, basically inviting Americans to come to him. And he had this big porch in Canton, Ohio. Totally ruined his garden and his lawn and everything, but the people came. I think there was hundreds of thousands of people that came to Canton, and they come in groups, and they would be organized. They would be given something to eat and something to drink, and then they would be brought to this yard, and he would get out on his porch and he would give a speech, and it would all be orchestrated in terms of who he was talking to and what he should say as a result. And it was kind of a brilliant strategy. And ultimately, he beat William Jennings Bryan in that election, and he beat him 4 years later again when he was renominated.
Yeah, I mean, there's I know there's books been written on it, and it's kind of this brilliance of raising the money, of finding different ways politically to strategize to win, and it's goes back to that thing we talked about in the beginning, where he just had this. He finds a way. He found a way to win. I mean, Jennings Bryan was a huge figure for American politics, and he was very, very charismatic and good orator and all these things. And the fact that he beat him is remarkable twice. So he gets into office, first term, and I guess the question here is for McKinley is, what was his vision? So he has this expansionist idea, the country is growing. What was his kind of leadership style, and was it from the outset wanting to do this? Like, let's keep expanding the country, and as we'll talk about, there's certain things where the places where he was trying to put himself or the country, it seems very strategic in trying to get various territories now and things like that. So what was kind of the philosophy or the worldview or the vision, I guess, for that first term?
I don't think my reading of McKinley is that he did not assume the presidency with the idea of turning America into an empire. That was not driving him. He was focused primarily on domestic matters. We'd come out of the panic. He hadn't come out of it when he was elected, but he brought us out of it, the panic of 1893. And he thought that raising tariff rates would help that. And so he sort of got on his horse and galloped off to pull that off, which he did to a significant extent. So he was thinking about prosperity. The big word for him was prosperity. He wanted economic growth, and he wanted more and more Americans to be sharing in the results of that growth. But we had this problem, which was Cuba, not very far from us, 90 miles from the tip of Florida, in insurrection against Spanish rule. It wasn't the first time. That during the Civil War, about that time, a couple of decades before, there'd been a terrible battle, ongoing insurrection and revolt of the Cuban people wanting independence from Spain. And that was kind of settled by compromise and negotiation. But it rekindled, and now it was really awful. I mean, people were dying in large numbers. Not just through war, but through a sort of a pacification program that the Spanish were executing in Cuba. And Americans were outraged by this, and a lot of anti-Spanish Cuban insurrectionary forces were organizing themselves in places like New York and Florida. And that was creating a great deal of tension between Spain and the United States. But we basically said we can't stop people from doing what they want to do as long as they're not breaking our laws. So he inherited this situation. And then he also inherited a situation whereby Hawaii had been upended from its longtime monarchy and was being run now by people who came out of American society but had been in Hawaii for many, many, many years. And they were running the government then, and they were interested in an annexation, not unlike Texas was annexed some decades before. So McKinley immediately wanted to move on that annexation situation. It was highly controversial at the time. A lot of people opposed it because they could see that this is like turning America into an empire. You didn't want to be like the Brits. Right. Or the Spanish, for that matter. Or the Germans were trying to get anything they could in terms of a colonial imperial enterprise. So he managed to get Hawaii into the United States, but not until the Spanish-American War was actually raging. And the Spanish-American War occurred because McKinley essentially was saying, and here's where it really sort of crystallizes the distinction between the view of many that McKinley was an inert figure that had events kind of wash over him, and my view, which was that he knew exactly what he was doing. And what he did was he basically said to the Spanish, look, this is destabilizing our neighborhood, and we're not going to let this continue. So you can negotiate a settlement, you can give up, you can leave Cuba, or you can win the damn thing. But you're going to have to end this because this can't continue. And the Spanish, of course, said, well, who are you to tell us? We've been in Cuba for centuries, and we're not going to have to listen to you. But he issued ultimatums that basically said, you've got so much time. And they realized that he had the power. We had a big navy in the Pacific. We had a significant navy in the Atlantic, and they had navies in both places as well. So this is making a long story quite short, but nevertheless, he put enough pressure on him that they felt like they were going to have to basically say, we're not going to succumb to this pressure. And then the famous episode of the battleship Maine blowing up in Havana Harbor, which precipitated the war finally. And we were ready for it. We destroyed their Pacific fleet at Manila Bay, and we destroyed their Atlantic fleet at Santiago, Cuba. and kicked them out of the Caribbean, and kicked them out of the Philippines, and kicked them out of Guam, and picked up a significant amount of overseas territory of our own, in addition to Hawaii. So that makes McKinley, by anyone's standard, a consequential president, because he transformed America into an overseas power. He made it possible for us to project power into Asia through the Hawaiian Islands, and also to maintain a significant military and naval presence in Asia through the Philippines. So a very significant president just on the basis of that.
Yeah, so there's a few points there. So obviously you mentioned annexation of Hawaii, obviously the involvement with Cuba. I'll come to Cuba in a minute, but it sounds like on your way of understanding it, that it wasn't as if McKinley had this grand plan to make the United States this world power empire, much in the same vein as Britain or Spain. But more so that there was a war with the Spanish, and I don't want to say a domino effect, but there was a kind of a rippling of sorts that, like, well, this happened, and then all of these other things just kind of, like as you say, just kind of washed over him. It just kind of happened that way, and then we, were managing it, or kind of custodians of it, if you will. And how it turns out is interesting. Obviously, Guam became a territory. The Philippines, became independent at a certain point, etc. I'll come back to the Philippines, but on Cuba, you said there were 4 reasons for going to war with Spain over Cuba. I guess not just exclusively, but you say the humanity of it, national interest, economics, and safety. How are these things enough? I don't want to say a sell, but how did he sell this or promote this or convince Congress and the American people that this is good enough to send troops and ships and all that to fight for?
Well, what's interesting is that a lot of these things, in this case, these 4 things you mentioned, which I think are all apt, are all sort of intermeshed.
Yeah. So
it's hard. You can't. It's hard to pull one out and say, okay, here's how this worked. Because it worked in conjunction with the others. So that when he became president, there was a great humanitarian surge of sentiment against the Spanish and sympathy for the insurrectionist forces and the Cuban people themselves. Yeah. And McKinley couldn't ignore this. This was a significant political reality in American politics. So there were obviously other people who were sort of saying, "Well, let's get Cuba. Let's take it." Well, there was a piece of legislation passed, largely by people who didn't want their humanitarian views to be sort of confused with the expansionist imperial attitudes, and so that legislation passed that basically said we will not take Cuba. We will not. This country forswears any designs on the island of Cuba. And so McKinley studiously observed that and made it very clear that whatever we're doing, we're not trying to get the island of Cuba. But these other things were still rippling through. And then wars happened because events inflame peoples. Right. And they were already inflamed as a result of what was happening to the Cuban people from Spain, but they were inflamed particularly with the blowing up of the Maine. By the way, there's no particular reason by our time to believe that was malicious or planned. I think it was an accidental explosion that occurred internally to the Maine, but nevertheless, it certainly inflamed America. Sure. And it was hard to convince people that
it was just an accident.
Nefarious intent.
Right. Yeah. I guess the it's interesting because I feel like for people, the little that people know about McKinley, they, myself included, I thought this for a while it was another kind of not imperial, but a very expansionist kind of idea. And the way saying like, no, we're not doing nation building in Cuba, right? We just don't. This is problematic, and we don't want this to be problematic, right in our, with our neighbors in our backyard. So how did, I guess, just, the war goes on, but how did Spain finally let Cuba go? And then, how did McKinley, I think the real amazing thing about this, as you say in the book, is that there was really no debt from this. And so how did we deal, as you mentioned, the economy was huge getting elected, and then that's what he was concerned about for his first term, and all this other foreign affairs stuff happens. And then you have this war, and then you don't really have any debt with it. So how did he manage to not have any, new massive debt incur from a war?
Well, America was growing pretty substantially, and that was affecting it. He inherited debt. The country wasn't debt free. The only president who ever paid off the debt was Andrew Jackson, and he was the first and the last president to ever do so. Mm-hmm. So that we weren't. Your point is correct, but it's not totally correct to say that we had no debt. We did have. But we had resources, and because we had so much growth, we had access to capital, very easy access to capital. And when, during the tensions between the United States and Spain, Congress passed, I'm not going to be able to remember the amount, but it was, I think, something like $10 million or something, just to basically give to the president to be used in this issue involving Cuba. And it shocked the Spanish because they were in terrible straits financially as a nation, and they couldn't conceive of a country where the legislature could just basically throw that money at the executive in such a fashion. But let me say this. Maybe before your question, I'm kind of preceding it or anticipating it, but a good example to sort of explain this or illustrate this would be the Philippines. Yeah. So we destroyed the Spanish fleet at Manila. We essentially took over Manila. The Spanish sued for peace. They asked the Spanish ambassador, a guy by the name of Cambon, to be an intermediary between the Spanish and the Americans. And demonstrating McKinley's resolve, he just basically said, here's where we are. And it became an ultimatum. And at the beginning of the war, he wrote in a piece of paper, which he kept in his pocket. During the war, we must take all we can get. After the war, we must keep all that we want. Now think about that. There's a president of the United States going into a war, and think of the moxie and the audacity in which he's basically saying, we're going to use this war to basically take everything we can. Then afterwards, we're going to win it to such a point where we're going to be able to basically dictate the terms. And he did. So when Cambon came in and said, okay, they like these terms, and McKinley says, no, we want Guam, or an island in the Pacific, ended up being Guam. We want Puerto Rico. You have to get out of Spain, out of Cuba, but we don't want Cuba. We're not going to take Cuba. And we will negotiate the Philippines. So he left that open. So in negotiating, he had time to sort of ponder this and study it to some extent. There wasn't an awful lot of information, but he did study it pretty thoroughly for what he had available. And he concluded that, well, first of all, we're certainly going to take a naval base because we're building this navy and we're becoming a nation that can project power through its naval forces throughout the world. And that therefore we have to have a naval base. But if we have a naval base, we got to be able to protect it. And you really can't protect it because the Spanish are going to get kicked out, or the Spanish, if they either going to get kicked out as a result of this negotiation, or they're going to get kicked out by somebody else that's going to come in and take the pickings because they're going to be very easy pickings. And so we can't, if we get the Subic Bay on Luzon Island, we're going to have to protect. We're going to have to protect Subic Bay through getting Luzon, but we really can't protect Luzon unless we have the rest of the Philippines, because the Germans were out there, the Brits were out there, the Japanese were interested in expanding and finding strategic locations, and all these Western countries were basically carving up China to getting strategic locations and places for their naval bases, etc. So he concluded that the only feasible approach is to take the full Philippines. And then we get into what you're raising about the humanitarian views, the nation building, the building up the democratic prospects for people that aren't used to that kind of government, etc. And that all got meshed in. And if you read McKinley, he bought into this. He was a humanitarian, but he was also a realist. And so I did this when I was researching the book. If you sat down and you tried to parse, okay, here's where McKinley is the humanitarian who wants to basically spread democracy to these people that haven't had it and aren't ready for it. And here's the realist and the nationalist who wants those naval bases and wants America to expand and increase in its power vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And you try to scrape these two parts separately, you can't do it because they're all intermeshed.
Yeah.
And it intermeshed in his mind, probably in ways that he doesn't even understand. But nevertheless, those two things were very, very powerful. And, we know from our history that the humanitarian Wilsonian concept has driven us an awful lot, certainly since 9/11 and what we've done in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And the powerful imperial or the global dominance ethos is very powerful as well, and has been as part of our American foreign policy since 9/11 as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So just real quick. So obviously the short term is the second term is 5 months. So how did he decide to run for re-election? And you mentioned he beat Jennings Bryan again in a rematch. and so, why did he decide to run for a second term? And how did Roosevelt become involved at this point? And and he ends up winning it, and what his plans were.
Well, I think that the second term was natural. His first term was obviously very successful. He was hugely popular. He enjoyed that. And so I think that he just felt that he could serve the country well, and that he certainly felt that he would have every prospect of getting a second term if he ran. And so it was a natural thing. And I think he liked being president. He liked the power, and he liked wielding the power, and I think he felt that he was wielding it for good. And he liked to think that he was doing things for good. So that was a natural thing. TR. Well, TR is a fascinating person.
Yes, he is. Yes, he is.
And in many ways, a very, very sympathetic figure. In some ways, not so much.
Yeah.
But TR was desperate to get back into government when the Republicans took over, and all of his friends, they basically said we should give him he should get the assistant naval secretary job. Well, McKinley was a little bit wary of that because he had heard that, as he said to one of Roosevelt's patrons, your man Roosevelt is known for causing all kinds of turmoil and getting into spats and things like that. And they said, no, he knows that he can't do that, and he's not going to do that. And so he becomes assistant naval secretary under the Navy secretary, a guy by the name of Long, a former governor of Massachusetts. And Long, in his diary, makes clear that he really liked Roosevelt, and he's funny, and he's clever, and he's kinetic, but he's out of control half the time. Long was not a young man, and he sort of felt like he needed to take a nap from time to time, so he'd go home early. And he found that he couldn't do that because he didn't know what Roosevelt was going to do in his absence. If Roosevelt felt like he had the power of the naval secretary, moving ships, sending out instructions about where they should be, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and then the war comes, and of course, Roosevelt, in his inimitable way, immediately creates that fascinating military unit, Rough Riders, and sends it. It goes into Cuba and becomes a hero, and immediately becomes governor of New York. Well, the powers that be in New York, the bosses, the Republican bosses of New York, can't stand Roosevelt because he's their enemy. He's their sworn enemy. He doesn't like those guys either. And they're trying to find a way to get rid of him. And one way would be that if he could maybe get on the ticket as vice president. Well, it was a little bit easy because McKinley's first vice president, a New Jersey politician, died in office of cancer. So the job was open, and Roosevelt made it very clear that he didn't want the job. He went all the way down to Washington at one point to basically say to McKinley and some of his people that he didn't want to be vice president. So please don't try to get him to get on the ticket. And one of the McKinley's people who knew Roosevelt very well says, well, of course, Theodore, you wouldn't make a very good vice president anyway. And Theodore hated that. He didn't think that was very funny and thought it was totally insulting. So he shows up at a convention in the headquarters hotel wearing his Rough Rider hat. And everybody knew that that was a signal now that he really did want attention, and the way to get attention. And there wasn't any other significant matters to come before the convention because everything was serene in the party, and McKinley was running things just fine. But Roosevelt had a problem, and McKinley did too, and that was Mark Hanna. We haven't talked much about Mark Hanna, but he was a brilliant, very sympathetic figure. He gets a terrible bum rap in history, but I really like him. And but he hated Roosevelt. He hated Roosevelt because he didn't think that Roosevelt would be loyal. He would always be out for Roosevelt. And that he was out of control too much. And so he actually set himself up trying to cut the legs off of the TR movement that sort of exploded in the convention when he showed up in his Rough Rider hat. And so McKinley has to sort of rein in Mark Hanna and almost scold him, basically saying, I'm not making a position here, and I don't want you to assume that I am or to take this upon yourself. And so Mark Hanna dutifully backed off, and Roosevelt becomes the vice presidential nominee, and then ultimately, when he's assassinated, becomes president. He said immediately that he wanted to continue the McKinley policies.
Yeah,
we'll talk about that, what that might be, but he didn't really mean it. And he later told reporters very, very early on when he got back to Washington from Buffalo, where McKinley had been killed, and where he died, he basically said, "I'm going to run this country just as if I'd been elected myself." And Roosevelt was not the kind of person who ever shared the limelight or credit with anybody else. He took it all upon himself. And his biographers kind of bought into that thesis that McKinley was the inert guy who didn't really run things and didn't really bring about the big changes that occurred during his presidency. And so history has sort of adopted that. And I set out, and part of the reason that I had that audacious subtitle was I set out to disabuse history of that. I'm not sure I've succeeded, but it was kind of a worthy effort, I thought.
No, I mean, I at the very least, you give McKinley his due and show why he's very underrated, underappreciated. And I think that it's as it is. I mean, he's, kind of, obviously he's gone. He's killed, but what came after him, was Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was such a huge figure, big, obviously successful president. But it wasn't just him, right? Then you have his cousin, a couple years down the line, and then it's the Roosevelts, right? It's this big, and that, really for the 20th century, and really, Lyndon Johnson was, and was doing, he was a New Deal Democrat thing, and it just, that really carried really through much of the 20th century. It was huge. So it's not surprising that McKinley gets forgotten of sorts, or his achievements aren't as seen as big as probably they should be. And so I mean, that's what I think the brilliance of the book does, is that it shows, like, wait a minute, yeah, Roosevelt was cool, but we're forgetting about the guy right before him and how momentous he was in many ways. I have a few, 2 or 3 quick questions here on McKinley here. His main priorities in the second term, it didn't happen obviously, but was reining in the trusts, which Teddy talked about that, and then wanting a trade reciprocity program. So still pretty domestic, still on the trade issue. Wanted the canal through Nicaragua, and I think Roosevelt sort of kind of was thinking about that, and then eventually went to Panama, and there's a whole history. It eventually got built, and then it was given back to Panama. So, but wanting to do the canal through Central America. So how are these things kind of in the mind of McKinley for wanting to do another 4 years? And then, just kind of, the assassination and what we know about it, and, how it happened.
Well, with regard to his agenda for the second term, you mentioned reciprocity. This is very fascinating, and I think it reflects a certain element of greatness in McKinley. As the great high tariff guy and the protectionist, he began to realize that America was producing so much in the way of both farm and industrial product that it could no longer be the protectionist nation that he had always wanted it to be. And it takes a certain kind of a person to basically say that my defining position in politics needs to be redefined and needs to be refined or revised. And he did that. So he realized that with all that productivity going on, we needed to sell our products overseas because the domestic market wasn't going to be sufficient. And that if we were going to do that, if we were going to sell, we have to buy overseas. And so he realized that free trade, carefully calibrated, needed to be incorporated into it. But the way to do that was to protect us from predatory actions on the part of our trading partners. We needed to create reciprocity, meaning that we would reduce our rates if they would reduce their rates in a reciprocal fashion. And that was when he went to Buffalo to the great exposition of the World's Fair of the time. He had a major speech in which he outlined all this. And I thought it was quite remarkable. TR pretty much jumped it. He just brushed it aside. Panama, or the Isthmus Canal, was also very much on his mind. And he wanted that because it fit in with the acquisition of Hawaii and the building of the Navy and making America a global power. And you could greatly enhance the firepower and the reach of our naval forces if you could get through that canal. But we had a problem. We had a long-time treaty with Great Britain that basically said neither they nor we would build a canal except in conjunction with the other, so that it would be jointly ministered and jointly defended. And that was just unacceptable to America's expansionist forces. And so that had to be renegotiated. And his brilliant Secretary of State, John Hay, negotiated an alteration of that, and he sent it to the Senate, and it was rejected by the Senate because it allowed the Brits too much prerogative in the relationship. Hay was really angry, but he went back and he renegotiated, and we got the Brits out of it. So now the way was paved. And that all happened under McKinley.
Yeah.
So he was moving in that direction.
Mm.
And then the other thing you mentioned was the third thing.
The assassination.
The thing that he was thinking about in terms of his policies. The trust.
Oh, the trust. Yes.
Well, he was admonished by many of the people close to him that was something that needed to be addressed. And he constantly was saying that I want to do that.
Mm.
He placed reciprocity, the trade issue, ahead of dealing with the monopolies and the trust.
Mm.
But I have no doubt that he would have done that. He would have done it unlike TR. He wouldn't have been as dramatic and flamboyant, but he would have done it in his inimitable, slow, steady, undramatic way.
Mm.
I had a letter when the book came out, after the book came out, from Robert Kaplan, a friend of mine who's written many, many, many books on foreign policy and geopolitics of the world, both historical and current.
Mm.
And he expressed to me the view, based on the book, that had McKinley not been assassinated, we'd be talking about him now as one of our great presidents, certainly within the top 10. And I think that's right.
Wow.
Because he had big plans and ambitions, not as a result of his being a visionary, but as a result of his seeing opportunity as it emerged and seizing it and molding and shaping it to his interests and to the American interest.
Just on that, I mean, it's a kind of tangential. I don't know if you want to say anything about it or if it's a false comparison. But when I think of trade now, I think of stuff like NAFTA, which has plenty of criticisms, and there's people for it too as well. And then the TPP, and I remember. If I remember correctly, it was the end of Obama's second term, and there was all the drama about people hadn't read it and they were reading it to try and vote for it and all these things. But I remember Obama's argument, whether you agreed with it or not, his argument was this pragmatic, which is true to form for him, of, well, if we don't get involved in that area, China will, and that's a problem. That becomes very problematic, right? And so, of course, it's very complicated, it's very messy, but I'm just trying to give some kind of context to it. Was Kenley's trade reciprocity program, all these things are different, but was it big like that? Was it pragmatic of the time to try and say, how do we handle this? How do we try and figure this out? Was it that bold? Was it that big of trying to say, yeah, this is really important?
I think it was huge.
Yeah.
I think it was huge because it offered the prospect that we could get beyond the old conflict between the free traders and the protectionists, which was a huge fault line in American politics. And with reciprocity, you could begin to reduce tariff rates in a way that wasn't going to be harmful. And I think that in terms of more modern times, there's a significant body of thinking that we opened up trade with China in a way that ended up being harmful to a lot of American workers and a lot of American interests. So reciprocity wouldn't necessarily have been a bad concept to introduce to that. And I think that you could argue, looking at the Trump administration and particularly its trade negotiation, Bob Lighthizer, that was somewhat along the lines of what he was trying to do, whether you agree with it was done well or not, or whether you agree with that or not. Right. It did have a ring of McKinley's reciprocity to it.
Well, and I mean, I think the trade issue with China, I think currently is something that is pretty, people on both sides of the aisle agree that it's problematic and it needs to be fixed. So I guess the last piece here is, he gets assassinated, unfortunately, and we don't have to get all into the details, but, maybe just brief snapshot of that, and then his legacy. What's the legacy of McKinley and the ways in which we can most accurately remember him as president? Well,
yeah, he's killed in early September of 1901, and lingers for a time, but develops a sepsis sort of thing and dies.
Yeah.
And I would have to say that I think I probably emphasized sufficiently in this discussion we've had that I consider him to be a consequential president on a lot of counts. And I think that he's I would rate him higher than the academics do in the historical polls. He gets rated not low and not even middle, sort of upper middle, you might say. But I would say that based on what he accomplished and what he did in 5 years or less, he would be in the sort of, top 10 or 11. I would drop a few of the people who are up there down further, but then that's just my view. So I think that he has a great legacy, but I don't think that he's going to get much credit for that legacy going into the future, just as he hasn't had much in the past, notwithstanding my effort to change all that.
Well, I mean, listen, your effort is tremendous. I mean, it is obviously I read the biography on Polk, and that was fantastic. But in some ways, I think maybe it's just because McKinley is he has a lot of layers. He's dynamic. I really enjoyed the biography on McKinley. The book is called President McKinley, Architect of the American Century. It's available everywhere in softback now, or paperback, I should say. And anything, any good places where people can find you or reach out to you if you want, and anything else that you have for the future?
No, I'll let it go at that, and I thank you very much. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Yes, no, you have been extremely gracious with your time. I absolutely loved talking with you, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Same to you.